Dear students, today in this lecture, we are going to discuss about the requirement engineering processes. Requirement engineering is actually widely dependent on the application domain on which the system is to be developed, and also people involved and the organization developing the requirements. The requirement engineering process widely depends on all these factors. So, in the requirement engineering, basically it is divided into four broad activities, as you can see in this particular slide. That is the requirement elicitation, requirement analysis, requirement validation, requirement management. Okay, uh, and this elicitation here, when we say requirement elicitation, is nothing but actually the identification of the requirements. Requirement analysis is basically analyzing the identified requirements, whether the requirements are complete or not, whether it's a requirement, multiple requirements are has been already combined into one particular requirement, or this kind of the anomalies are actually identified by through analysis. Requirement validation, whether the identification and validation of the requirement is done to identify whether the requirements gathered are actually representing the system to be developed, this is system that is going to be developed. Similarly, requirement management is basically managing the changes in requirement that may occur when in the process of development. Okay, how to manage the changes. So these are different activities which are basically, you can say, are uh, iterative activities, and they are also actually, you can say, it's a iterative process and they are interlinked. So this in this particular discussion, we'll see a particular diagram actually, which is this particular diagram, which is actually a spiral view of these activities. Okay, that is, you can see the requirement elicitation here, requirement specification, requirement validation. Okay, the final output of this particular entire activity is the system requirement document. Now, starting point here, you can see the start document here, the start, and from here it is in the requirement elicitation process where you start here, and then you go for the requirement specification, that is to specify the requirements in certain format. Okay, as I told you, these are actually the interleave activities. So after that comes the feasibility study. Okay, the feasibility study is actually the basic, uh, you can say, is a short and focused study. Actually, that should take place early in the requirement engineering process. So a basic study, you can say, which actually, you can say, there are three key questions which are identified in the feasibility study. Those three key questions are like, does the system contribute to the overall objective of the organization? Okay, whether the system is going to contribute to the overall objective of the organization. Can the system be implemented within the schedule and budget using the current technology? Okay, so, and also, can the system be integrated with other systems that are used? Okay, so these are some of the key questions through which the feasibility study is done, the basic study is done. After these questions, answers that are found in affirmative, then also then only we go for the further, that is, which we proceed further for further requirement gathering for development of the system. So after feasibility study is conducted, we go for user requirement elicitation, that is identification of the user requirement. Already we discussed about what is user requirement, right? Those are the abstract requirements statements in natural language actually, for which are actually collected for the customers. So then you go for the user requirement specification, whether that is to write those requirements in a certain format. Okay, and then go for validation, that is the prototyping. Mostly prototyping is used for validation. Okay, and then you go for the detailed requirement specification, actually that is called as the system requirement elicitation. Okay, the identification of the requirements, that is requirements in detail, and then go for the specification of those detailed requirements, and finally the review of the requirements, and you get the a final document in the form of system requirement document. So the most important activity in the requirements engineering is the requirement elicitation and analysis. So this is you can also call it the requirement elicitation or requirement discovery, because it leads to the identification of the requirements. Okay, so basically this identification is done by whom? This is basically done by the technical staffs which are working with the customers. Okay, uh, and what they find out? They find out about the application domain, the services the system should provide. So what kind of services is expected from the system, and the system's operational constraints. So different constraints that are involved in the system. So when you say operational constraints, basically the constraints like that the duration for which the system needs to remain active, what is there, if there is some authentication, specific authentication required for the system, okay, authentication mechanism to be implemented, and this kind of, there may be some say speed or memory or many other constraints can be there. Okay. So under which the system is going to operate. So, and how to collect this information? The technical staff basically collects this information from the end users. That means the probable people who are going to use the systems, the managers of the customer farm, okay, the engineer involved in maintenance. If there is an existing system which is going to be innovated, then the already those engineers which are actually involved with the maintenance, okay, domain experts, those who have knowledge of the domain in which the system is to be developed. So from domain of expert also, trade unions, etc. So these people who are from whom the requirements are identified or requirements are gathered by the technical staff, these people are called as the stakeholder of the system. So as discussed in the previous slide, software engineering basically works with these stakeholders, different stakeholders, to find out different application domains in which the application domain in which the system is going to work, the services the system is going to provide, the constraints that are involved in the operation of the system. Okay, so this may be system performance, hardware constraint, etc. So all these requirements are basically identified by the software engineer by consulting with different stakeholders. Now there are certain sub activities which are involved in this particular activity, within this activity, and these activities you can say as the requirement discovery, requirement classification and organization, requirement prioritization and negotiation, and requirement specification. Okay. So first is the requirement discovery, that is initial identification of the requirement. Then the requirement classification and organization. Once the initially requirements are identified, they are classified into different categories. Okay, and then requirement prioritization and negotiation. So there may be some requirements may be prioritized to implement earlier. You know? So the priorities may be set for the requirements, and also there may be certain negotiations about the implementation of the requirements or inclusion of the requirements, and then requirement specification, that is to specify the requirements in certain format in the document. Okay, so this is, you can say this diagram basically identifies these four stages or four activities within the requirement elicitation and analysis process. That is initial requirement identification, then goes to requirement classification and organization. Okay, and then after that you go to requirement prioritization and negotiation, and then you move to requirement specification. Okay, and from there again you may go to requirement discovery stage. So this is a basically a cyclic process for requirement identification and analysis process. So in broad, we can say the requirement activities, uh, that is how to identify, how to discover the requirement. Requirement are basically discovered by interacting with the stakeholders to discover their requirements, right? Domain requirements are also discovered with this at this stage. So you know who are the stakeholders as we have discussed in the previous slide, and with discussion with those stakeholders, basically the technical person or software engineer identifies the requirements, and then requirement classification organization. So related requirements are grouped or organized into certain uh, clusters. Okay, that is, they are coherent clusters to which the requirements are gathered. They are separated. So one cluster basically consists of some related requirements into one cluster. Then another cluster will have another set of related requirements, etc. So after that, prioritization and negotiations. So prioritizing the requirements and resolving the requirement conflicts. So some requirements may be more, maybe the technical person may identify some requirements to be more important than other requirements. So in that case, the priority has to be set to those requirements, that these requirements has to be met uh, before the other requirements. And also the resolving requirements conflicts. So if there are some conflicts that arise of the requirement while setting their priorities, then that has to be resolved. Suppose uh, one person in the end user is setting a priority level to one user, giving a priority, more priority to one particular requirement. Another user, end user, may be giving more priority to another requirement. So those, while setting the requirement priority, those conflicts has to be resolved. Okay. Requirement specification is basically to document the requirements. Okay, that is, the requirements are documented and the an input into the next round of the sprint. So basically, writing down the requirement in certain specified format. So there are certain problems that occurs in the requirement elicitation process. Uh, Many a time the stakeholders do not know what they really want. They may be, the stakeholders may found to be confused about what they actually want out of the system. Okay. Sometimes stakeholders express the requirements in their own terms, which may be difficult for the technical person to understand, developer or software engineers to understand. Okay. So different stakeholders may have conflicting requirements. As I told you in the previous slide, that is, the stakeholders may set different priority to different requirements. So that may conflict while prioritizing the requirements, etc. Okay. So organization and political factor may influence the system requirements. So there may be certain internal politics in the organization of the customer organization, which may actually influence the system requirements. So that is another problem in the requirement elicitation, because the development team, for the development team, the main priority is to gather good requirements and make the system usable. Whereas the internal politics of the customer organization may actually found to be counterproductive. Okay. So similarly, the requirement change during the analysis process. If there are some requirements that change that occurs during the analysis process. Okay. Um, and some in the process of gathering the requirement, some in between some new stakeholders may emerge. Okay. And also, so what will happen is that if the new stakeholder emerge, then you may have to change certain requirements, because you have to take the opinion of the new stakeholders. Similarly, the in the process of getting the requirement, the business environment may also change. So all those this kind of situation may actually create problem for the identification of the requirements. Then comes the requirement validation process. Basically, requirement validation is to identify what actually the customer really wants. That is the requirements whether which you have identified in the previous activities are actually the requirements that the customer wants, whether they are the actual requirements which the customer really wants. So that identification and uh, uh, that particular, you can say, to set to identify that whether requirements get are really correct or not is done in the requirement validation process. Okay, requirement validation activity. So requirement, if there is some error in the requirement And in the implementation phase, in the later phase, when the system is implemented, if such errors in the requirements are uh, found, then that cost of that requirement, correcting that requirement is very high. So requirement validation is a very important steps, because uh, if your requirement is validated, then your that error is likely to be less. Okay, if requirement is not properly validated, then there is likely to be error in the requirements, or in the later phase you may find some requirements in the requirement error in the system. So ultimately there will be some additional cost and a huge amount of additional cost in the final system. Okay, so as you can see here, that is, fixing a requirement error after delivery may cost up to 100 times of the cost of fixing an implementation error. Okay. So basically, at the time of delivery, if some requirement errors are found, then the fixing of the requirement error may cost actually 100 times of the cost of fixing the implementation error. If there are some implementation error occurs and you find at the delivery time, that may not cost very much, but the requirement error will cost a very high amount of cost will be involved, because you have to um, actually redo everything from the initial phase to correct that requirement. And there may be, a spiral amount of activities. There may be, from one activity you maybe there will be, so correcting the requirement, there may be many other correction that may you have to do in that particular uh, chain chain of activities. So requirement correction or fixing of errors in the requirement normally are very high if it is found in the later stage. So then comes the requirement checking. So actually the requirement checking is a activity within the requirement validation. Okay, valid. So as part of the requirements checking, the following things have to be done. That is the validity. That is to validate. Uh, that is to identify, that is, if the system provides the function which best support the customer needs. So whether the system provide the functions which actually supports the customer need. That is, whether you are whether the requirement that you have gathered are actually what the customer wants. Okay, that is nothing but the validation. So similarly, consistency. That is, whether there is any requirement conflict. That means whether the requirements that they have gathered are consistent. There should not be any requirement conflict. Already, I have told you, I have discussed about what is a requirement conflict. This is basically the setting of the requirement by different stakeholders. Then the requirement conflict may arise. So one stakeholder may want one kind of requirement, whether the other person may uh, uh, require some exactly the opposite of that requirement the other person stated. So in such cases, the conflict may arise. So completeness are all the functions required by the customer, are that is, whether all the functions that are actually required by the customer is included in the system. So that indicates the completeness of the requirements. Okay. If it is, if everything is included, then it's okay. That's complete. Otherwise, it is considered to be incomplete. So realism, that is, can the requirements be implemented given available budget and technology? That is actually the feasibility studies that comes from which the realism check comes. Okay, because feasibility study is also part of the initial requirement analysis. Verifiability. Can the requirements be checked? Whether the requirements are verifiable. That is, whether you can check the requirements. So that comes in the verifiability part. So different techniques that are used for requirement validations. Okay. So one kind of techniques is requirement review. That is systematic manual analysis of the requirement, to do some manual analysis of the requirements systematically, to review the requirements that have been gathered. Next comes is the prototyping. So basically, prototyping is nothing but a executable model which is being developed only um, for checking the requirements. Okay, that is to validating the requirements. So that can be so it can be done through prototypes. A executable model of the system to be developed can be done for a particular specific category only for checking the requirements, and then that can be verified. So test case generation. So developing the test case for requirements to check the testability. So you can generate the test cases for the requirements to check whether the requirements are testable or not. Okay. So these are different techniques through which the requirement validations can be carried out. Then comes the requirement review. Requirement review actually, uh, after all the detail of the requirement have been, that is system requirement have been gathered, then the review can be actually conducted, or review can be formulated. So both client and the contractor staff should be involved in the review process. That is both the developers teams member as well as the customer team member should be actually sit together and review the system to review the requirements, okay, whether the requirements are correct or not. So that is also a particular validation technique. So review may be formal, that is with completed documents. So formal process may be adopted, or maybe review can also be done informally. Okay. So good communication between developers and customers and users can resolve the problem at the early stage. So review, since it is actually a manual process of sitting together of the members of the development team and the customer team. So if there is a cordial relation between the team members, then it becomes easier for them to resolve the any conflict that arise in the requirements. Okay. So during the review process, the following measures can be taken. One is the verifiability. While reviewing the system by the members of both the team, they can actually verify whether the requirements are realistically testable, whether the requirements those which have been gathered are actually testable or not. They can be tested, or comprehensibility. That is the requirement properly understood? So the meaning of comprehensibility is that they analyze the requirements in to identify whether those requirements are understood or not, properly understood or not. Whatever has been gathered is understood by those technical persons or not. Traceability, is the origin of the requirements clearly stated? That is to identify from where the requirements have actually originated. So that becomes a traceability. So if some error occurs, then traceability becomes an important measure. That is to identify where the requirement has actually originated. Okay. So adaptability, can the requirement be changed without large impact on the other requirements? So that comes in the adaptability factor. That also needs to be reviewed or checked by the teams while reviewing the things. That is whether this uh, the requirement that is the requirement can be changed or not in the due process of development. Because if it is not changeable, then they are less adaptable. If it is changeable, means they can be the requirements can are those requirements are more adaptable to or with less impact on the while developing the system. Okay. The last major activity is the requirement management. Requirement management is basically process of managing changing requirements during the requirement engineering process, okay, and the system development. That is during the development process, some changes may on the requirement may arise. So how to manage those changes, that becomes the part of the requirement management. So uh, this is because the new requirements that actually keeps emerging while the system is being developed, okay, or even after the system is gone to use. So for this actually to manage the requirement, we need to actually go keep track of the individual requirements, okay, and also to maintain some links among the dependent requirements, okay, so that you can assess the impact of the requirement change. So if a particular requirement which is emerging is dependent on some other requirements, that dependency needs to be tracked so that you can easily manage the impact of the requirement change. Okay. So you need to establish a formal process for making the change process and linking this to the system requirement. So basically for this you need to establish the formal process for making the change proposal and linking this to the system requirement. So for any changes to actually formally deal with any changes that are required uh, as the as the part of the requirement implementation or requirement change requirement management. So changing the business and technical environments of the system actually always change after installation. Okay, so there may be some hardware may be introduced. Okay, it may be necessary to introduce interface the change system with other systems. The business priorities may change. Okay, so new legislation and regulations may be introduced that the system must necessarily abide by. So these are the different regions for which the requirement change may come. So because of the changing in the environment of the business, also as it is being done here, the new legislation, etc. So there are different factors for which the requirement may change. So people who pay for the system and the users of that system are rarely the same people. There is another reason. Many a time, uh, the people who actually pay for the system and the people actually who are going to use the system are may not be the same set of people. So in that case, also the requirement change may come. Okay, because the requirements have been gathered from the people who have paid for the system, and later it is found that some other set of people are giving some other set of requirements or demanding some other kind of requirements. Okay, so the system may have to be changed. So these are the requirements. These are the reasons for changing requirements. Okay, so large systems usually have a diverse user community with many users having different requirements and priorities that may be conflicting and contradictory. So when the system is small, the requirements are going to be a comprehensive set of requirements which may be complete. But when the system is very large, there is a diverse set of community which may be using the system. So in that case, there is always likely to be some requirement priority changes or conflict in the requirements. Okay, contradictory requirements may be gathered. So so final system requirements is basically so that is written in the final system requirements means the requirements which are actually um, which are stated in the final requirement document. So those detailed requirements are inevitably a compromise between them. There's any conflict if there is any conflicting requirements, it has to be somewhere in between. A compromising requirement has to be stated there. Okay, which it is often discovered that the balance of support given to different users has to be changed. So somewhere in between, some between the conflicting requirements, some compromise has to be adopted, and that has to be set in the final requirement document. So that is how the changing requirement has to be dealt with. Requirement evolution. For these changing requirements, there may be the requirements may actually keep evolving. So initial understanding of the problems may be different, then maybe there will be some initial requirements which will be collected from the initial understanding of the problem, and then change understanding of the problem is little quite different from that, and so there will be some initial requirements which have been gathered will be given to which can be included in as the input to that particular activity, that is change understanding of the problem, and then obviously those initial requirements may have to be changed quite a bit to get the change requirement. So this process evolves over a time. That is, from the initial understanding of the problem, whatever requirement has been gathered, that will be taken as input to the change understanding of the problem and final set of requirements that can be identified as the change requirements. So this is the process of evolution. Requirement management planning. So because as already discussed, that is changing of the requirements and identification and re-implementing the requirements is a very costly affair. So a proper planning is required to identify the changes and to incorporate the changes in the software. So this actually establishes the level of requirement management detail that is required. So requirement management decision, requirement identification, each requirement must be uniquely identified so that it can be cross-referenced with the other requirements. So requirement management decision may actually initially uh, goes through these steps, that is requirement identification process, where each of the requirement is actually uniquely identified and cross-reference with the other requirements. Okay, because there are some changes, so dependencies of the requirements has to be identified. So after that, a change management process. Um, Now, what is the change management process here? That this is the set of activities that assesses the impact and the cost of changes. Okay, that is to identify what uh, cost that will involve while changing the requirement. Okay, so that impact has to be analyzed. So that is the change management process. Traceability policies, actually this define the relationships between each requirement and between the requirements and the system design that should be recorded. So so any dependency relations or between the requirements has to be identified. Okay, so this is the traceability policies. Tool support, tool that may be uh, used range from the specialist requirement management system to spreadsheet. So different kind of tools which are used by the requirement management system, the people who use the requirement management system, that is the tool support. So these are the things that are required for requirement management decision. So deciding if the requirement change should be accepted. If any requirement changes really occurs, whether it should be accepted or not. So there are different factors based on which these decisions are taken. So problem analysis and change specification. So during this stage, the problem or the change proposal is analyzed to check that it is valid. Okay. So uh, the problem, that is the software's, the problem related to the software, that is the objective of the system, actually the software, and the change proposal that has come is analyzed to check whether the whether that change in the requirement is valid or not. Okay, so that is the problem analysis. So this analysis basically feedback to the change requester, who may respond with more specific requirement change proposal or decide to withdraw the request. So once this particular the requirement change is analyzed, basically it is identified um, that whether this is identified and is checked to the already to the software, that is the problem statement, and if it is found to be valid, then this feedback, whatever is done, is basically sent to the change request, or the person from which the change request has come. Okay, uh, and it is that change requester may respond with a more specific requirement change proposal. Okay, and decide to withdraw the request. So or decide to withdraw the request. So it is sent to the change requester to identify whether the change requester accept that proposal, that is that change that has been analyzed, the result of that particular analysis process, and or the change requester comes with a very specific implementation, specific requirement change proposal, or the change requester may also wish to withdraw that particular requirement change. So for that, it is the particular person's opinion is taken before implementation. It goes for the specific inclusion in the software. So next deciding factor, or the next phase, is the cost analysis, that is the change analysis and costing. So as we have discussed earlier, that is change in the requirement is basically is a costly affair. Okay, so Change analysis, the traceability of the changes, the number of changes that will be required to incorporate the change in the requirement, that is done, and the cost is calculated. Okay, what cost will be involved in the requirement change. So after finally all this, after doing these two phases, the last is the change implementation. So requirement. So it is ultimately in this particular stage, the change that is proposed by the some users is included, and it is being included in the design and the implementation. Okay, and it's modified. So that is the change implementation. So the steps involved in the requirement change management, as we have discussed in the previous slide, is given here. That is, identify problem, that is the change in the problem, says change in the requirement, that that the identification of that change, the problem analysis and the change specification. So it is analyzed in terms of the problem document, that is the software problem, and then uh, whether it is a valid change request or not, that is being identified, and then change analysis and costing is done. How much cost will be required and what kind of changes will be required, and then finally change implementation is done. Okay, and the revised requirement. So after that, the revised requirement is found out after this. So that is the change in the requirement gets implemented. Thank you.